Welcome back, everyone, to our series on textual criticism. Today we're starting the New Testament series. After a brief introduction, we'll look at the writing materials and source identification. We're using Kurt Aland's book, The Text of the New Testament, an introduction to the critical editions and theory and practice of modern textual criticism, 1995. Excellent resource. So again, we're going to have a brief introduction, and we're going to look at some of the basic writing materials that were used for the New Testament texts, and then finally the system of symbols that were used early on and how they have changed into what we use today. By way of introduction, the 27 books of the New Testament were initially circulated as separate literary units. Paul's writings were likely the earliest to be collected. We have evidence of this from at least 95 AD. By 180 AD or CE, we read about the Gospels as part of a collection. In the beginning in the 3rd century, the Gospels and Acts are found together. The Catholic letters were collected later in the 4th century. Now, papyrus was the earliest material to be used for the New Testament manuscripts. Papyrus comes primarily from Egypt. That's where it was primarily manufactured. Strips were cut and laid side by side, and then additional strips were cut and laid perpendicular to those, laid side by side, and then they were moistened and fused together that way when they dried. They were formed into rolls of up to 10 meters, as opposed to ending up in scroll form. We see the codex used in the New Testament. It was easier to write on the obverse, but the direction of the fibers made it more difficult to write on the reverse of each page. Just as sort of a nota bene, the nomina sacra is characteristic of the early papyri, and this is the abbreviation of the word kurios, here with kappa sigma, with a line over it, and theos with theta sigma. And Jewish or Christian origin of the copies of the Septuagint can be identified based on the use of the nomina sacra forms. So you can identify this manuscript of the Septuagint as either of Jewish origin or of Christian origin based on the use of these forms. So an important thing to note. When we move past papyri, we move into parchment. Parchment came into use in the 4th century. It was made of animal hide, usually sheep or goat. The hair was removed and it was treated and rubbed with stone and other things, but it was more durable than the papyrus, but the strips of the papyrus allowed for this these horizontal lines, natural horizontal lines when writing on it. These were not present in the parchment, and so incisions had to be made, lines had to be incised to follow in writing. Paper became commonly used starting in the 12th century. We have the earliest evidence of paper being used in the New Testament text from the 9th century, but it's very common, or it's more common in the 12th and on. Out of the 5,400 New Testament manuscripts, approximately 1,300 of them are written on paper. Now, having looked at how the books generally circulated originally and the different basic materials for New Testament texts, let's take a look at what we will use as text critics when we look at the individual manuscripts, how they are identified in our New Testament editions. So how did this develop? Well, the first New Testament edition, Greek New Testament edition, was made by Erasmus. In 1516, it was published in a hurry, and it was based on only about 4 or 5 manuscripts in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, without getting into a lot of detail here, when he went through the book of Revelation, at the end, the manuscript was a barred manuscript, and it was fairly deteriorated and broken off altogether. And so he back translated the text, which brought into Greek, which produced an awful lot of errors. Wettstein in 1751, 1752, he had 200 manuscripts or so at his disposal for his edition, and he identified uncials using capital letters, minuscules using Arabic numbers, as well as the lectionaries. He used numbers as well, and this is how he identified the individual manuscripts in the edition. Caspar René Gregory in 1908 identified the papyri using the initial P, so P45, P51. He kept the numbering system of the uncials, the capital, quote-unquote, letters, text of the capital letters, with the 01, 02, 03, that's what he utilized, but he kept Wettstein's capital letters for the first 45 uncials. And we'll get into that a little more as we start looking at the apparatus, or when we start looking at the apparatus. The minuscules, he kept the numbering system, and then with the lectionaries, he used a prefix L to identify them. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to the New Testament texts. Coming up, we're going to look at how to use Kurt and Barbara Alon's book to identify which manuscripts, or how to identify the manuscripts of the New Testament so that you can understand how to use this resource more effectively. So stay tuned.